No
All right, thanks everyone for coming tonight. Welcome to Liberty Me You. We're here tonight with Angela Keaton and Scott Horton. Angela is the Director of Operations at Antiwar.com, and Scott Horton is former host of Antiwar.com radio and now host of the syndicated talk show, The Scott Horton Show. And tonight they're going to discuss why war is some bad shit. As Angela said earlier, it may be a little depressing. I can't advise the usual drinking games in good conscience unless you really know how you're going to handle it. So be careful out there. It's dangerous. Don't want to have any casualties. So without further ado, I'll give you Angela Keaton and Scott Horton.
Do you have audio yet? Okay, I guess we do. All right.
Yeah, I'm fine.
Okay, terrific. All right, my name is Angela. I've worked at Antiwar.com now since 2008 and became involved with the organization in 2006 thanks to this man who's on the other screen here, Scott Horton. Scott, quick introduction because I want to jump right in with asking you some questions.
Oh, me, I'm just a radio show host from Austin, and I host Antiwar Radio on KPFK in LA and the Scott Horton Show for the Liberty Radio Network.
All right. All right, Scott, I think we're going to start at the beginning.
Really, I guess I could say I pretty much am the editor of Antiwar.com, even though I got laid off 2 years ago. I do all the work, so I think that counts.
Yeah, basically, yes. Well, the thing is, though, tonight, we were talking about this earlier, that, you and I were going to have this conversation tonight, and it's weird because 15 years ago, did you think that you and I would still be doing what we're doing, or there'd be a need for us to do what we're doing? And I kind of wanted to go back to the beginning, and actually you kind of surprised me with a year earlier. You started at the now infamous pirate radio station, Free Radio Austin, in 1998?
Right. Yeah, the very end of 1998.
And what were the early themes?
Well, I mean, honestly, I was more of kind of a New World Order conspiracy kook back then, like a one world government guy. Even though I wasn't a John Birch Society conservative, I was always a libertarian. But I did buy the whole grand design toward building the United Nations into a world federal government kind of thing. And then I should have learned that was wrong by the time of the Kosovo War in '99. But I didn't really finally shake all that stuff till about the time of the Iraq War. But anyway, I was a connoisseur of the very best of left and right conspiracy stuff, and I still to this day, but back then I was highly motivated and energized by the Waco massacre and the cover-up of the Oklahoma City bombing. And I learned very early on, because of my kind of conspiracy readings and stuff, about the connection between central banking and war. And even though I guess I probably was pretty default anti-war anyway, when I learned all this kind of criticism of it from more of kind of a John Birch right-wing point of view, a very anti-war point of view, not because they're kind of hippies and saying give peace a chance, but just because they're saying this is what's destroying America on the inside, is waging all this war without. And so whether they're really, working on building a world government or not is beside the point when you get to the question of militarism abroad and then coming back home again, as obviously we're suffering now. So that's kind of been my thing. My first show on Free Radio Austin was all about Waco and the realignment, how the best of the left and the right can realign with the libertarians for peace and the Bill of Rights and save all the stupid culture war stuff and fighting about gay marriage and abortions and whatever other stuff people want to fight about until after. Some of that's worked out. Other stuff won't.
Well, I wanted you to do that as an introduction because Waco is kind of a central symbol to kind of why we're still here tonight and why I think we've sort of come full circle with all the horrible things that one could have assumed that would happen if we continued with an empire at home, empire everywhere, because we're under it. When we met because of Waco, and Waco was what changed me from, I was always a standard issue libertarian, but my objective as dominant Jane was really heavy. I was that objective as jerk that no one, people would run from. Waco definitely tempered that instincts in me, but Waco is what made me see some things differently too about the Rothbardian centrality of the war issue, and that's kind of, and then by 9/11, I think both of us kind of ruined perfectly normal lives by going in this direction, and that's kind of why it's like a sad, weird thing 15 years later. We're still sitting here. But I kind of wanted you to go a little bit into the history of different phases of Iraq so we can understand why we're still here and why it's
Yeah.
absolutely the worst this time.
Well, I don't know, Angela. Honestly, like I'm stuck like this anyway. If it was nothing else, I would just hate cops and be a libertarian radio show host about cops or something, probably. But really, definitely the reason that I'm stuck like this permanently with no hope is because of, 11, 12 years ago, and not just September 11th, but just how obvious it was, the way that they announced, we're going to lie to you right to your face for the next year and a half, and then we're going to start a war against Iraq. just, it was just unbelievable. I mean, maybe some of the people watching tonight were too young to remember kind of the way that happened, but they really were, for people paying close attention, it was obvious in the fall of 2001 that they're going to Iraq. So then, the invasion didn't happen until 2003, March 2003. So it was a year and a half of the slowest motion train wreck in the entire world. And, you could have been anybody, as long as you didn't have a reason to want to buy into it and believe in it, then it was obviously the world's worst hoax. And it was obviously going to be an absolute disaster. And, so, that was what really solidified, my turn toward, like, this is what I absolutely have to do. Somebody's got to do it. Somebody has to contradict these people. And I guess I'm pretty good at it, so I try to, for what good it does, I don't know. But, yeah, I mean, the level of dishonesty, and it's remained, but the level of dishonesty in 2002 and 3 is some serious, all-time world historical levels of lies. It's just absolutely beyond the pale.
Well, what were some of the popular misconceptions about what people thought the war was about going back now 12 years? What did the average person think? Because this is kind of key to how they were able to do this.
Well, I think what the average person thought was that Saddam did it. And, I've talked about this on my radio show a million times because it's just the perfect example. I was a cab driver at the time, and I had a guy in my cab who was a real estate developer and was a millionaire and was like, the Mr. Big Shot at the country club and all this stuff. He was a really smart guy. I mean, he knew a lot of stuff about a lot of stuff. Not just real estate or something. He was a very worldly type of a dude. Millions of dollars and high education. And I got in the world's worst argument with him. But it was an honest argument. You know what I mean? It wasn't like too mad. And what he just could not get over was, well, if Saddam didn't do 9/11, then why are we attacking him? And I think that really sums up basically the misconception of the American people about the whole thing was, well, come on. I mean, we wouldn't be attacking a country that didn't have anything to do with it, so this country must have something to do with it. And it was really a year and a half, 2 years into the war when Bush finally cornered in a press conference. Someone said, yeah, but what did Iraq have to do with that? And he said, with what? And they said 9/11. And he said, nothing. And there were people across America, by 100 million people, who just dropped their glass and spit milk out their nose and couldn't believe what they just heard. What did he just say? Nothing to do with it. But I thought that was the whole thing. And they didn't outright say, well, Dick Cheney did, and the neocons on the lower level did. But Bush and Rice and the very highest level people, other than the vice president, didn't really say Saddam did it. But they were happy to let your mom believe that kind of a thing. They were happy to let that be the impression and warn that, oh, he's going to give his chemical weapons to these guys to do on us next time. And so we got to go ahead and stop them now. And that was the biggest misconception. And people just filled in the blank themselves because they just couldn't imagine if they were the president that they would exploit 9/11, the worst thing in the whole world. They're going to exploit it like they might as well have done it themselves, the bastards, in order to launch an extra war against an extra country and threaten 60 more. Like, people just couldn't get their head around that. They couldn't believe that America is run by evil men. Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what they'll do. It's the worst. And so, yeah, that was the worst of it. And then look what they did. They created such a mess that where there literally was no, I mean, no Al-Qaeda in Iraq before 9/11, before the invasion in 2003. there's now 30,000 of them, and they have their own country now.
Well, let's to give it some context, and I know because I'm judging from the chat room, there's many young people in the room, which is great because there was a time not very long ago where some of us thought, "Wow, we're the last generation that it dies with us," and that was 2006. A lot of us were thinking that. So this is a miracle that young people are listening. But to give context to the events of 9/11, just short and sweet, what happened at 9/11 and why, and we're talk about the why and sort of the larger context of terrorism.
Well, the best thing to do, and we're trying to keep this a little bit light, right? So here's what you do if you want a good laugh, chat room. Go and find the interview of bin Laden's son from Rolling Stone magazine from 2010. And he tells the reporter from Rolling Stone all about how in the summer before the 9/11 attack, right before he left, and before that, no, he was there for a couple of years. Oh, let's screw the story up. At the time of the election recount in the year 2000, bin Laden was rooting for Bush, and he was so pleased that Bush and Cheney won because they were so easy to peg as a couple of pretend tough guys, soft-handed warmongers with the most corrupt political, corporate type connections, and it was easy to see that, if Al Gore was going to exploit 9/11, George Bush was going to exploit 9/11 to the 100th zillionth power. And so that was the plan, was to recreate the Soviet Union's failure in Afghanistan by luring the United States there to lead us to bankruptcy and then to force our empire out all the way. And then when Bush went to Iraq, that was just, as Michael Scheuer said, the hoped for but unexpected gift to bin Laden. That was just accomplishing his goals only times 10, because not just creating a whole new jihadi battleground, stateless battleground for people to fight in, but it also is about 1,000 miles to the west on the other side of Iran from Afghanistan, where they were all exiled in no man's land over there. They weren't even welcome in Sudan anymore, for crying out loud. And Bush brought them to the Levant. That's why now it's called ISIL, the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. Bush brought them. Well, Bush and Obama, too. We can get to the Obama part in a second. But basically, these two presidents together have brought al-Qaeda within 50 miles of the Mediterranean Sea. And so, that's the deal, is that he was counting on the Americans to exploit the attack and overdo it. And so that's exactly what they did, and that was why he mocked us in his re-elect George Bush speech in October of 2004, right before the election. He came out and said, "Yep, I'm still here, re-elect Bush, because you're doing me a great favor." And he's very upfront about the whole thing. He said, "The only people benefiting from this policy is me and my goals, and the companies, the corporations that are politically connected to the administration in charge. Everyone else in America is suffering." And he was saying, all you got to do is call it off anyway, fair warning for the millionth time. And this goes to what's going on right now. Now they don't even have to knock our towers down. Now they just cut two of our reporters' heads off and put it on live leak. And that's enough for Klaus's Belly to go right back and continue the same thing. They even complained that when Zawahiri from Al-Qaeda complained back in 2007 and 8, when Bush was signing the agreement to leave by 2011, he said, "No, we don't want the Americans to leave. Not till they've spent $10 trillion, not till they've lost 100,000 men, not till we've completely bled them to bankruptcy and forced them all the way out." So, his orders were try to find a way to provoke these guys into staying. And so now here we are coming back again. And so all they have to do is not lose, right? I mean, they completely marginalized Al-Qaeda in Iraq back in 2007. And then they went away for a little while, and now they're back again. So you can't hunt down and kill every last fighting age Sunni male like John Podhoretz said we should. You can't do that. Short of just nuking the Sunni triangle, there's always going to be an angry Sunni with a rifle, an excuse to go back.
Well, before you get to John Podhoretz and the neoconservatives, I want to go a little bit back in time to, the 9/11 attacks. One of the things that divides the movement is there are people who have disagreements on what the origin of the events of 9/11 are. And I wanted you to talk a little bit about blowback, because actually you and others like Ron Paul, unless you were soothsayers, were talking about things like that, possibilities of what could happen back in 1999. And I've never noticed any chip in your head or Mossad connection, or magic powers. So I think, you probably have a reason for thinking that. Maybe bring up a little bit of the matter of Robert Pape and the political science behind this too.
Yeah. Well, first of all, on the inside job thing, I don't completely dismiss it. I mean, the fact that the Bush family, James Baker, Dick Cheney, do business with the Saudis, are friends with Prince Bandar and Saudi intelligence and this and that. I think it's possible that Bandar maybe helped organize getting the last 15 hijackers to America to serve as the muscle, something like that. But in my personal opinion, I'm sorry, I don't mean to challenge anyone's religious beliefs. In my personal opinion, 999 out of 1,000 9/11 truth factoids just don't hold up. And so, sorry. It could be that, they deliberately turned a blind eye to it. The real point is they might, as far as that goes, is that they might as well have. They exploited it so cynically that, that George Bush and Dick Cheney might as well have butchered those 3,000 people to death with their bare hands, with knives. The bastards, the way that they use them. So that's what I got to say about that for starters. But then secondly, I still remember sitting, at my parents' house reading about Osama bin Laden back in 1996. I mean, they had a subscription to Newsweek. What was I supposed to do? So, they were interviewed back then. And, really the Al-Qaeda's war against the United States started back with the first World Trade Center bombing. And it wasn't really Al-Qaeda yet, because you don't really call it Al-Qaeda until Egyptian Islamic Jihad merged with the Azzam group, which was bin Laden's mentor, Abdul Azzam. But Abdul Azzam told Eric Margolyes in 1989, "You're next, Yankee imperialist." And Eric Margolyes said, "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yeah, you're the evil empire after the Soviet Union. It's you, pal." And so this was the group bin Laden took over, and then he merged it with Ayman al-Zawahiri's faction of Egyptian Islamic Jihad. But Omar Abd al-Rahman, the blind sheikh, who him and his guys blew up the World Trade Center the first time, and yes, the FBI could have stopped it and didn't, but I don't think it was deliberate, and it wasn't their plot. It was Islamic Jihad's plot. And Omar Abd al-Rahman was, basically counterpart to Zawahiri, interchangeable with Zawahiri. And the groups came together, formed Al-Qaeda. They did the Khobar Towers attack in 1996 which Gareth Porter, the greatest reporter in the world, has proven for a fact was Al-Qaeda and not Iranian-backed Saudi Hezbollah, which is a fiction of Israel and Saudi Arabia's government's imagination there. And then they did the Africa Embassy attacks in 1998 in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, and Nairobi, Kenya. And then they tried to do an attack just like the Cole attack, which failed, but was noted at the time, but the dinghy sank. They had it overloaded with too much explosives. And then they did the Cole attack in 2000. They tried to attack LAX in 2000, but a border guard got lucky and nabbed the guy's ass at the Canadian border. So these guys are real guys. These are not all just, ridiculous FBI entrapment stings like we see on a daily basis. There was one just the other day. Did you see it? This girl who was trapped in a chat room in some fake terror plot. These are not all that. They are real people, and they have a real agenda. And you mentioned Robert Pape. There's a strategic logic to suicide terrorism. It's asymmetric warfare. It's just like judo. How does a weak opponent defeat a stronger opponent? Well, you got to outwit him, and you got to use his energy against him. And again, with the recreating the Soviet Union's failure in Afghanistan situation. And so what they're trying to do is provoke America into overdoing it, into basically blowing it. And so for somebody like George Bush and his entire group, they were only too happy to take the bait, basically, to fall for it. But, for people who think that people just, you couldn't have that attack, well, what about all the suicide attacks? Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and thousands maybe of suicide attacks in Iraq, waged by Al-Qaeda in Iraq against Shiites and against Americans during that whole occupation. Those weren't all, didn't have a Mossad chip in their head to make them suicide bombers. Arabs are not automatons. They're real people. They have their own, plots, even if you can't understand the language they're conspiring in. And just look at the beheading videos. People are saying that they're hoax videos. Well, there's kind of a hoax in their production, but that's really their decapitated heads at the end of the videos. No doubt about that in the minds of friends and family of the victims there. And what are they trying to do? When somebody cuts somebody's head off and says, "Don't you come back here," what's he saying? He's saying, "I dare you to come back." He's calling Barack Obama a sissy and saying, "I bet you're not man enough to come and do something." And so Obama has to take the bait. It's as simple as that. Matthew Ho, the former Marine and State Department official, wrote an article at the Huffington Post. It's really good. I interviewed him about it for the KPFK show. It's called "The Beheadings Are Bait." Just, period. The beheadings are bait. Don't fall for it. They're trying to get you to do stupid things. So, cutting off Sotloff's head, cutting off Foley's head is just, 9/11 writ small. It's an attempt to make you trip up.
Well, and I'm glad we got this, and the focus has been sort of on the consequences to the U.S., but I'd like to maybe switch to the consequences, though, of what the United States government did in Iraq, because these are, as our buddy Anthony Gregory says, the worst thing that ever happened in the 21st century.
Yeah, you're saying that the motives in provoking the attack. Well, see, yeah, okay, after the Mujahideen left Afghanistan, Osama wanted to throw Saddam out of Kuwait. But the king of Saudi Arabia said, "No, I'm going to have George H.W. Bush do it for me instead," which drove bin Laden mad. And then not only that, of course, they stayed. They came to Saudi Arabia and they stayed. And then they waged a blockade and enforced no-fly zones over North and South Iraq and a sanctions regime on Iraq all through the end of the Bush years, throughout the entire Clinton years, and the early Bush Jr. years, that killed 1 million people, half of them children. And Bill Clinton's Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, was confronted with those numbers. And no, really, I mean, there's real journalism behind this. The UN officials in charge of enforcing it all resigned in disgrace and said, "We can't do this anymore." And I don't mean in disgrace like they were forced out. I mean they resigned because they couldn't take it anymore, kind of thing. And Madeleine Albright said, "We think the price is worth it for the strategy, which is ridiculous on its face, that by starving the Iraqi people to death, you'll make them so desperate that they'll overthrow Saddam," which of course they had no ability to do whatsoever. And but anyway, it was those bases in Saudi Arabia that were used to blockade and bomb and kill so many Iraqis just indefinitely, right? For 12 years, 13 years. And this is going on and on and on and on. And that was the primary cause cited by Osama bin Laden in his declarations of war of 1996 and 1998. That they are, because of the bases in the Holy Land of Mecca and Medina, being used to admittedly target civilian men, women, and children of Iraq in order to collectively punish them and terrorize them into somehow changing the behavior of their evil dictator that they obviously have no control over whatsoever. And of course, America's support for Israel as well and other dictators around the region. But that's the top of the list. And it's important to say here that bin Laden was an evil civilian butchering monster himself. And there's no reason why anybody ought to listen to him or take anything that he says seriously or whatever, right? He's the lowest scum of the earth, and we don't take the word of murderers. What's important is that this was his recruitment shtick. This was how he got people to listen to him, was by saying, "America is at war against all of Islam. Let me prove it to you." They occupy the Holy Peninsula. They bomb and destroy and kill the men, women, and children of Iraq. They support the Israelis in their unending slaughter of the Lebanese and the Palestinians. They don't say a word if they don't outright support the Russians, the Chinese, and the Indians in their wars against Muslims. They, make all our dictators sell their gas dirt cheap. This was back in the 90s. Make them sell their gas at dirt cheap and cut all the Arab people who really own it out of the profit sharing when they're living on $1 a day in squalor and this kind of thing. So he would cite specific American foreign policies. He did not say Americans are free and their daughters wear mini skirts to their junior college and then they go vote in the Democratic primary and we just can't take it anymore. That was never the problem. It was certainly, even if it was his obsession, which it wasn't, it was certainly never his propaganda. The way that he got people to join him is he would say, look at the innocent people America kills. It's beyond dispute. It's beyond dispute.
Well, what decent person, though, would be for the, blockading medicine to children, or for just, occupying other people's countries with our soldiers, or the occupation of Palestine? Like, that's something that distinguishes a civilized person from a horrible person, correct?
Well, yeah, although, I have to try real hard to let my fellow Americans off the hook a little bit. It's mostly out of abject ignorance. And so, but yeah, there's a lot of hard feeling there. You look how willing people are to support an air war. Oh, we won't support a ground war, but an air war against Iraq? Sure. Bomb them all day. See if I care.
What did actually happen in Iraq, though, afterwards is that completely, utterly, the United States government totally destroyed their infrastructure, got rid of their hospitals, their schools. Iraq was a completely functioning country, even though Saddam is a horrible human being, obviously. But we totally destroyed that, and as you've mentioned on the show repeatedly, Iraqi Jews, Yazidis, Druze, and others had protections. Saddam wasn't obsessed with homosexuality. It wasn't as far as that kind of a country, it was not a horrible hellhole.
Yeah, unless you cross the Ba'athists. And it's true that the Sunnis kept the Shia down. I mean, the Shia basically, and I hope you understand, I just mean this as a metaphor, not in any kind of personal way. They're like the poor blacks of Iraq, basically. They're the outclass. They were, under Saddam Hussein, the outclass. And so, the place was far from perfect. But yes, you are absolutely right. And it is important to know, it's extremely important to know, that Iraq was not Afghanistan, where it's, the town of Bedrock. And it's just, they never, got out of the 9th century or whatever in the first place, except, when the communists came to town and put up electricity for a little while or something. I mean, Iraq was absolutely a wealthy country. Their entire infrastructure was built up on, 3 or 4 generations of oil wealth. And, yes, women wore jeans to the university. That's just an absolute fact. And Druze and Chaldean and Maronite Christians and Assyrian Christians, the Yazidis, the Turkmen, and all the other minorities were safe because Saddam had a real monopoly on killing. No one else is allowed to kill but him. That was the rule. And so, they were protected. And, when it wasn't him killing them. And so, honestly, it's a tragedy. 1 million people died, by good estimates, Angela, in the war between 2003 and 2010. And that's, the Opinion Business Research and the Lancet and Johns Hopkins studies, would at least leave us in the very high hundreds of thousands. Most of which was people who were Sunnis who were killed in the Civil War by the Shiites backed by America, kicking them out of the capital city of Baghdad, which took a long time and a lot of torture and murder to accomplish. And in fact, if I can say one more thing about it, not that I care either way who rules Baghdad personally, whatever, but just the fact that George Bush changed who rules the capital city of Iraq from Sunni to Shia and who populates the capital city of Iraq from Sunni to Shia like that alone guaranteed centuries of further conflict, or, decades and decades and decades of further conflict. Because there are going to be Sunnis across the region who just absolutely will not accept that ever. And yet, how the hell are they going to reverse it? It took the entire Army and Marine Corps to make it that way. So, under what power are they going to change that? I don't know. Say 80 years worth of suicide bombings or something. It could be, that's going to be a major sticking point for a long, long time that Bush changed that balance of power in that way. And not that I'm saying it's in and of itself evil that the Shia are in charge there, but although, of course, the Shia that Bush picked to run Baghdad are extremely evil. Yeah.
Okay, I want to. Wow, so we've got so much to cover, and we're only halfway through.
I'll try in shorter answers. Sorry.
Oh, no. There's just a lot of ground to cover. Because I want to talk a little bit too about one of the one of the really vapid talking points of some of the people of the center-right Democratic U.S. Party is that Obama got the U.S. out of Iraq. And I wanted you to touch a little bit about the later history and the status of forces agreement. Maybe talk from the surge on, kind of sum up to where we are now.
All right. Well, so what happened with the surge basically is that the Sunnis had already lost the civil war. They had lost Baghdad, as I was just saying. And so now they had too many enemies. They had the jihadists who were attempting to take them over and already had changed the name of Al-Qaeda in Iraq to the Islamic State of Iraq. And that got on a lot of people's nerves even back then that, hey man, you guys are a bunch of Egyptians and Saudis and Syrians and Libyans and kooks coming over here to help us fight. Thanks for the help, but no, you're not in charge of us. We're the Iraqis. We're from here. Whereas, of course, the jihadists don't even recognize the nation state of Iraq's existence whatsoever. But the Iraqi Sunnis who were from there were fighting the Americans, the Shiite militias, and then the Al-Qaeda guys who had grown too big for their britches. So at this point, too, George Bush needed a big save because 2006 was absolute hell on earth. And so, the James Baker Commission recommended getting out of Iraq by 2008. And then the neocons came to the rescue. Fred Kagan came forward with General Jack Keane and the surge plan, where what we'll do is we'll double down instead, and we'll send another 30,000 troops there. Although really that was just kind of camouflage, because what they really did, as Gareth Porter I think put it to me, the real victory of the surge was David Petraeus' victory over George W. Bush. He said, listen, you want to win this thing, we're going to do it my way. And that means you're not going to have victory over the Sunni insurgency. No, sir, you're not going to defeat them. You're going to bribe them. You're going to compromise with them, and you're going to become friends with them. You're going to pay them and arm them to patrol their own neighborhoods as long as they promise to marginalize Al-Qaeda in Iraq. So Bush did that. But then, of course, what that did was, first of all, they should have left way before this. They had already, at this point, given all of Baghdad to the Shia. So the Shiite parties had virtually no reason to want to compromise and work with the Sunnis anymore at all. Then he turns around and he arms and pays the Sunnis so much that they actually have kind of their own mini state for a while. They don't really have any reason to even try to seek compromise and opportunities to work with the new Shiite government in Baghdad. They create, basically they just arm up an independent Sunni state kind of next door on the promise that, oh no, Maliki, crosses his heart and hopes to die. He's going to bring all of these so-called sons of Iraq, these Sunni fighters, into the government, integrate them into the police, into the military, into the bureaucracies, and put them all on the dole, basically. Give them enough of a share of the national oil wealth that they won't fight. And of course, it was a pipe dream at the time. They never achieved it at the time. And this is kind of a small parenthesis, but I think it's important that, well, so what did they do with the 30,000 troops then, Scott Horton? If they sent 30,000 troops at the same time they quit fighting the Sunni-based insurgency, wasn't there a whole bunch of fighting in 07? Well, yeah, most of that was the army picked a fight with Muqtada al-Sadr because they hated him because he was an independent Shiite cleric who wanted America out. But Sadr was part of the the United Iraqi Alliance, the Iraqi Shiite party that ruled the parliament. It was 1/3 Sadr, 1/3 Dawa, and 1/3 the Supreme Islamic Council. And so they went to full-scale war against a guy that other than in East Baghdad and Najaf, they were fighting for him that whole time. And he's still an extremely powerful part of the United Iraqi Alliance and the parliamentary system in Baghdad to this day. They didn't kill him, they didn't marginalize him, they didn't defeat him. They just killed another few tens of thousands of people and got another, few hundred Americans killed for absolutely nothing whatsoever. It's the most ridiculous policy in the whole world. There's a whole book about it by David Finkel. I always screw up Finkel and Filkins. It's Finkel, David Finkel, the Washington Post reporter, called The Good Soldiers, about these guys just fighting the stupidest war in the whole world for absolutely no reason at all. They're fighting against their ally. The whole thing is completely ridiculous. But anyway, so that was the surge, and it did buy a temporary respite in the fighting between the Sunni and the Shia. But then Bush this is actually a funny story. In 2008, the Shia told Bush, get out and don't let the door hit you in the ass on the way. And Bush was saying, I want 56 bases. And Maliki said, you can't have them. And he said, I want 50 bases. And Maliki said, you can't have them. And Bush said, I want 25 bases. Can I get 25 bases? And Maliki said, no bases for you. And he said, well, can I stay and train? We'll leave some trainers in the country to train. And he said, okay, but no immunity. And so, but without immunity, then that means Americans could be prosecuted under Iraqi law, the way they are somewhat subject to Japanese and South Korean law. If they violate, if they commit a crime against a local, they can be prosecuted in local courts. But they're going to be damned if they're going to let that happen in Iraq. And so, no immunity deal, you can't stay. So, but what they did do though, is they backdated it and said, well, leave at the end of 2011. So then Obama, it was on him. He had 2 full years to negotiate a deal to stay. And he tried, although honestly, I don't think he tried that hard. But he did try to get Maliki to give him an immunity deal. And you know what really killed it, Angela, was the heroic Chelsea Manning, who liberated the WikiLeaks. And part of the Iraqi war logs was the story of Americans who massacred this family. And if you have kids in the room, put your fingers in their ears. They massacred this entire family, including shot their infant baby at point blank range. And then they called in an airstrike to try to cover it up. But the airstrike hit the wrong part of the house, and all the bodies survived. And the coroner got the story. And this was kind of, one of those atrocities, and then forgotten back in 2006 when it happened. But the story broke in November in the WikiLeaks in November of 2011. And so that was all she wrote for the last possibility that there would be an immunity deal. And so Obama had to pull the troops out. And, if they were there, they wouldn't have been able to do anything about ISIS anyway, other than maybe warn Obama that things in Iraq are getting much worse because you keep supporting the rebellion in Syria. And when Maliki calls you crying about that, you ought to listen to him because he's right. But they would have been able to fight him off.
All right, well, what did we build? Of course, we left something, and Justin Raimondo always refers to it as the size of the Vatican. What did we build in Iraq? What great investment did we make?
Yeah, well, they built this giant embassy, but it was designed back when they still believed all their own nonsense about how great this was going to be and about how we were going to own Iraq forever and we were going to have 56 bases and we were going to dominate the Middle East forever. And so they built this. It's a gigantic white elephant. I mean, you're right, it is. It's the size of the Vatican. And I think Justin says one day it'll be the Museum of American Atrocities. Before too long. Because it's probably not going to last as the American embassy anyway. But yeah, it's just, they did have to pull all the troops out, but they did leave a hell of a lot of spies and mercenaries and Marines just as guards there. But, America really started losing a lot of influence in Iraq by the time they were done winning the Civil War for the majority. Because at that point, they didn't need us anymore. And so at that point, it was just, Maliki in concert with Iran figuring out what they were going to do, including kick our asses out. It wasn't about, America hasn't been calling the shots in Iraq for a long time. Been trying.
Okay, and I want to just do about 4 or 5 more minutes on this until I do a little bit of historical context on neoconservatism, but why ISIS now? I mean, and why is Obama saying why? Why is he doing this? What are his motives, and why is this such a great idea?
Well, it's absolutely horrible, but okay, why ISIS is because Obama backed the rebellions in Libya and Syria in 2011, in Libya in 2011 through right now, really through a year ago mostly in Syria. Well, no, I don't know, through right now. That's because that's what Israel wants. They hate Assad because Assad is allies with Iran. And they don't care if it was Al-Qaeda knocked our towers down. Iran is their enemy. And so if Al-Qaeda is enemies with Iran, they don't care about that. They care about Iran and they care about Syria and Hezbollah. And so they insist that America care about Syria and Hezbollah more than the Mujahideen. And so Obama has, honestly, I know it sounds stupid, like some kind of birther type right-wing argument or whatever. But the truth is that Obama is guilty of the highest high treason of any American since Benedict Arnold. I mean, there's just no other way to put it. He has been putting guns in the hands of those sworn in allegiance to Ayman al-Zawahiri for 3 years. And, on my show, we've been calling him out for this the entire time. From the spring of 2011 on came the first reports that America, Saudi, Qatar, Turkey are financing the Mujahideen and sending Mujahideen to fight Assad in Syria. And it just absolute, talk about slow motion train wrecks again. Just, I can't believe they're doing this. I can't believe they're doing this. And all spring long this year, I did a whole series on the new generation of Al-Qaeda, the rebirth of Al-Qaeda. I was interviewing Patrick Coburn and Michael Scheuer and every terrorism expert I could think of about the re-rise of Al-Qaeda because of Obama's policy, all in the lead up to the fall of Mosul in June. It was that easy to see coming, really, that's what they've done. So, but now ISIS has broken off from al-Nusra, and contrary to bin Laden's policy of only fighting and fighting, they've gone ahead and declared a state, probably prematurely, like in bin Laden's prediction. As long as the Americans can come back, then you can't declare a caliphate. It'll be too soon and they'll come back and destroy it. And so that's what's happening. They've declared a caliphate. So now Obama's got to turn his Syria. It's funny as hell watching him try to turn his Syria policy around back to back in Assad again, like Clinton and Bush did.
Whoa, I just want to stop there for a second.
Against Baghdadi.
I want to stop for a second because it's a little bit on Assad here. Now, I remember a really lovely Empire moment where Susan Rice looks into the camera and she basically says, Assad, you're fired. Now, if I recall correctly, and because I listen to the Scott Horton show almost every day I can, didn't Assad used to torture for George Bush?
Yeah, now listen, he was never a Hosni Mubarak, loyal sock puppet of America. I mean, he really was much closer to Russia, to Iran, and not the United States. However, as Robert Baer, the former CIA officer, put it on CNN at least one time, he said, yeah, back in my day, he's talking about the Clinton years, and this counts for all of George W. Bush years too. He said, back in my day, you wanted somebody tortured, you sent him to Assad. You wanted him to disappear forever, you sent him to Mubarak. And so, yeah, the extraordinary rendition policy goes back to the foundations of the CIA's bin Laden unit under Bill Clinton. And they would just find these, kind of free-floating mujahideen around, and they would just kidnap them and usually send them back to their home country to be prosecuted and imprisoned, but in some cases sent off to Syria or Egypt to be tortured and killed. And so, in fact, there's huge scandals because Bush had Assad torture an innocent man named Mar Arar, who I follow on Twitter. And, he was just a completely, mistaken identity. There's the other guy, the grocer, Arar, and then what's the other guy's name? I just had it. Anyway, I believe there were two different guys that were innocent, mistaken identity cases that were sent to Assad and tortured. And so, and I'm not saying that's the right thing to ally with Assad or work with Assad against these guys, but I'm saying, just like Muammar Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein, if these guys have one virtue, it's that they hate the Mujahideen. They hate the Mujahideen. And our government is overthrowing every dictator with a clean-shaven chin in favor of these kooks. It's madness. It is. It's treason. It's absolutely out of control.
Okay,
oh,
there's a philosophical...
Wait. You asked me also why, about this war and why not do it. And the answer there is real simple. They're surrounded by enemies, so they can't get anywhere. Okay, they've got the Iraqi Shiite government, they've got the Shiite militias, they've got the Iranians, they've got the Kurdish, Peshmerga, and the PKK communists, they've got the Turks, they've got the Syrians, they've got the Jordanians, the Egyptians, the Saudis. They're completely hemmed in, landlocked by everyone who hates and fears them. And they're absolute, ridiculous, ruthless totalitarians. And I say ridiculous because they are absolutely ridiculous. They try to ban smoking. They try to just, completely, dominate the entire lives, like communists, of the people that they conquer. And just like I mentioned in 2006 and 2007, the local Sunni tribal system said, screw you guys, man. This is our country, not yours. And marginalized them and kicked them out. And so, There's every reason, Angela, to believe that the best solution, really, from a utilitarian point of view here, is to just sit back and wait and let this resolve itself. Let the people who are closest and have the most at stake do as heavy lifting as they can without us distorting their power on the ground. I mean, so right now the Shiite militias can't march into Mosul. But if we help them march into Mosul, well then what kind of consequences are we going to have from that? This is a city of 2 million Sunnis who don't want to be conquered by a bunch of Shiite militias, who fear these Shiite militias a hell of a lot more than they fear ISIS, who they have every reason to hate. So just don't do it. This is the perfect time for us to stop, because it's so clear that this is all America's fault. And yet these guys, they got 30,000 guys. They've got, get this, I read a Rand Corporation bean counter study that said and he was worried, okay? And he said their annual revenue is projected to be $2 billion. That's B. $2 billion is their annual budget. Okay? These guys make $2 million with an M a day. That's less than the Williamson County, commissioner's court brings in taxes on a daily basis, right? They're like the Khmer Rouge, right? They are a bunch of fanatical, nihilist, civilian butchering monsters. There's no doubt about that. But they just don't have the reach or the power, right? They don't have the ability to be as bad as they want to be, and there's no reason to expect them to get worse, only weaker and weaker from here. So it's the perfect time to stop. And somebody asked, write down all those names. All you got to do, Michael, is just get a map and look at where the Islamic State is now, and then just go counterclockwise. There's the Shiites, the Shiite government in Baghdad, and the Shiite militias behind them, the Iranians, the Kurds in the north, the Turks, and I should do counterclockwise this way for the camera. And then you got the Syrians, the Jordanians, and the Egyptians and all them down there. And there you go. They're completely surrounded by enemies. So they don't need the North American. The last thing we need is white American Christians coming and turning the whole damn table upside down again. It's not going to help.
Well, speaking of nihilist death cults, when I was a little girl, the catechism was that William Buckley threw Ayn Rand and Murray Rothbard out of the Garden of Eden, modern conservatism. And since then, we've had nothing but horror and hell. And in political science, we learned in Buckley as being the beginning of what we consider in the broader sense, the modern neoconservatism as being different from conservatism. It's a little bit of a different definition than what we generally think of. But that form of conservatism is split from modern American libertarian movement, one being life, the other being death, right? I think that's a fair way to describe the difference between libertarianism and neoconservatism, which were the struggle for the American right, even though I think most of us probably would resent being labeled on the right. So neoconservatism, the broader, all of it, both the nationalist form and the actual literal neoconservative kind of Irving Kristol, being part of what governing our foreign policy.
Well, yeah, no, I mean, I think, the National Review was founded by a bunch of Reds. So it's fair. It's kind of hard, really, to differentiate, the new right kind of in general from the 50s on with the real neoconservative movement that we tend to think of as really getting going at the end of the Vietnam War and through the 1970s and becoming Reaganites by the 1980s. So, but there are different generations, right? I mean, the National Review was founded with James Burnham and Sidney Hook and Whittaker Chambers and a few more of these former Trotskyite types. And so, it's modern American conservatism has, as Rothbard, probably wrote it better than anyone, has always been completely tainted by this irrational hatred of the Soviet Union and support for militarism and empire. And it's basically because a bunch of Trotskyites never forgave Joe Stalin for putting an ice pick in his ear. And so, that's why Americans have to go die in Iraq right now. But anyway, and then so as Jim Loeb really tells the story, I think the best, at the end of the Vietnam War, what happened was, and it was also at the time of the 1967 war in Israel. And this is when the new left became, very anti-militarist and to their mind, isolationist. And so they just figured whatever, their top priority is war overall, empire, in order to better protect Israel for the long term. And so they moved to the right, and they aligned first with Scoop Jackson, who was a senator from Washington State. They call him the senator from Bowen, because he just represented the military-industrial complex. And so a lot of them latched on to him, and then in the first Reagan administration, they were brought into a lot of positions in the Defense Department. And although they were really given mostly, unfortunately for the people of Latin America, they were given a lot of Latin America portfolios, but they were not allowed to dictate Middle East policy at all. Ronald Reagan kept them away from the Middle East, and so did George H.W. Bush. They were known in the Bush Senior administration by him and his alter ego, his best friend and National Security Advisor Brent Scowcroft, called them the crazies in the basement. And Bush Senior had given Scowcroft explicit instructions: keep the crazies in the basement. They're not allowed to mess around with Israel policy or anything else over there. And but then so they spent the 1990s agitating for war. And they created, really their own establishment. They got, and this is how it works, y'all. You got, 15, 25 think tanks or something, and they all fit in Bill Kristol's right-hand desk drawer, right? That's all they are, is a piece of paper with a bunch of names on them. And all the, proper documents filed with the proper taxing authorities and whatever. But then you have the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs, the American Enterprise Institute, the Heritage Foundation, the Center for Security Policy, the Emergency Committee for Israel, the Project for a New American Century. Oh my God. And you can just go on and on and on and on and on. And they just create consensus with, as Jim Loeb puts it, there's a great article by Jim Loeb called All in the Neocon Family about how, everybody is related to each other by way of Midge Decter or something. And so, they all have Thanksgiving together. You have the Podhoritzes and the Crystals and the Abramses are all intermarried and whatever. And so basically, really, really all of the neocons together are approximately, 63 people or something like that. And yet they just, boy, do they have a lot of spots writing for editorial pages of major newspapers and going on Fox News every Sunday morning, and et cetera, et cetera. And they never stop recommending action. And so politicians never get tired of listening to them and doing what they say, because what they say is never stop.
By action, you mean violence. All right, let's just be clear on that. We mean violence. And I just want to do very, very quickly, because in polite discussion, kind of the way certain things are to be brought about, we have to, people have to be very careful, because people get easily confused and they get conspiratorial. Basically, the matter of Israel is this. It's the longest, harshest modern military occupation of a country, and what Israel does is horrible and disgraceful. And if you do not believe in justice and from Waco to the West Bank, there is no point at all in doing what any of us do any day, every day. This is a total waste of time, because if our whole goal in libertarianism is to knock a few cents off your taxes or to, have freedom to choose whatever light bulb you want, this was a waste of time. So that's why we talk about Israel. It has nothing to do with conspiracies, religion, ethnicity, or any other nonsense. It's about brutality. It's about human rights. The Palestinians, what is happening in Palestine is an absolute disgrace and tragedy. And the U.S. will be remembered horribly, and not just for the whole empire, but specifically the support and the brutality of what goes on there every single day.
I absolutely agree with that. And honestly, I think. No, I totally agree with you, but just like I was saying earlier, and not that this counts as a free pass, because they don't really have any excuse, but the reason most Americans are so bad on Israel is because they don't know anything about it. And their basic impression is that poor little Israel is this tiny little strip of land surrounded by enemies, besieged and attacked all the time. But in fact, they're just wrong. They don't realize that what they need to do is zoom in closer. What they're describing is the Gaza Strip. Tiny little strip of land, besieged, surrounded on all sides by enemies, and constantly attacked and terrorized. And it's the Israelis who are the terrorists. And The fact that people have a narrative that's easy to remember and re-explain doesn't make it true. The fact of the matter is that Israel has no real enemies. Hezbollah can repel an attack from them, but Hezbollah is no offensive threat to Israel's north. Assad should have been their best friend in the whole world. The fact that they prefer Al-Qaeda suicide bombers to Assad just because he helps fund Hezbollah a little bit or whatever is absolute madness. If they had the slightest bit of sense, they would just leave him alone. He hasn't made a peep about the Golan Heights, which is Israeli stolen, occupied territory that truly belongs to Syria. He doesn't say anything about it, never has. They could have just left that well enough alone. The King of Jordan is their tiny little sock puppet. That's it. He is 100% owned, lock, stock, and barrel by Israel. The same thing for General Sisi, who overthrew the democratically elected government in Egypt. So, they're not besieged by enemies. They're not poor little Israel. They're armed to the teeth with hydrogen bombs and the nuclear submarines to do even second stage retaliatory attacks. They got F-16s and M-16s, and they murder Palestinian babies with them daily. And this is why people in the Middle East get so upset at the Americans, is because here we support all of this. You can't just deny where F-16s come from, man. Everybody knows they're made in Fort Worth. And so, this is even, and I'm not positive about all of this, but what the hell? This is the official story of the murder of Bobby Kennedy. Was he sent weapons to Palestine and sent to Israel to be used against the Palestinians. And Sirhan killed him for it. There's such a thing as consequences for your actions, and I'm not so sure that's really what happened to Bobby Kennedy, honestly, but still, I mean, it sure as hell is a plausible enough cover story anyway, even if it's not what happened. And, but anyway, that's the thing of it. The truth of it is, everybody's right-wing dad who says, oh, stand by Israel. They just don't know anything about it other than a bunch of stupid regurgitated slogans. Open up an atlas and show them a map. And show them this is occupied territory here. Do you understand? Since 1967, longer than the Soviets occupied Eastern Europe, the Israelis have occupied the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip. They're under a foreign totalitarian martial law. The Israeli government tortures their children. Tortures their children.
And tortures, and here's the whole conspiracy. If you kill people's children, they're going to hate you forever. That's blowback. That's terrorism. That's why things are horrible, because we do horrible things overseas with the money that they steal from us, and there's no getting around that. And that's why war is the worst thing ever. It's the worst thing the state does, and why libertarians should take this issue seriously, because that's what the end of big government is. I mean, I don't have to quote Karl Hess, right? But we know what happens. When you start supporting government, you're sooner or later going to support mass murder.
Yeah, there's an article at National Review today saying libertarians are for war. And he cites Rand Paul, who cites Caspar Weinberger, that noted libertarian anti-interventionist Caspar Weinberger, Ronald Reagan's Secretary of Defense, and Rand's support for attacking ISIS now, or the Islamic State now, and says, see, libertarians, you should listen to us libertarians. We're adults. We're for war, just like all you big tough grown-ups at the National Review. Pay attention to us. See, we're warmongers. Just look at Rand Paul, he said. And so, we have a lot more wind to shout into. I think, Angela. I don't know. We're not done yet.
It's funny. And, in the libertarian movement, there are only a couple things you can really unify people on. Thank God we can unify people on the issue of cops, right?
Yeah.
And the drug war. And cats. But beyond that, though, it's really hard to get a consensus on the most important issue. Though, honestly, I've seen very, very little pro-war propaganda among libertarians right now. I'm not seeing that. But I do see some great things I do want to promote here. Come Home America is a great compendium with everything from Ron Paul to Ralph Nader. All the greats are in there. We Who Dare Say No to War, edited by Tom Woods and Murray Polner. This is a history classic, all great stuff. Why Peace? Literally every libertarian and leftist and old rightist you can think of who's ever been against war is in Why Peace. And tonight I'm going to sit and quietly brood and read this, which is put out by Students for Liberty and the Atlas Network, which are libertarian groups, and lots of libertarianism in there. So anyway,
Cool. Hey,
wow.
can I?
So have we just? Oh, sure. Yeah.
Okay.
No one's gonna cut us off. We won't stop.
Oh, yeah, we are out of time. Let me just say real quick.
Okay.
There's a great thing at antiwar.com. It's a reprint actually of an interview that Rothbard did with Reason Magazine back in the 70s. But if people will just search our anti-imperialist heritage, Murray Rothbard, you'll find that at antiwar.com. It's really, really great. And then, of course, Rothbard also wrote War, Peace, and the State, Wall Street, Banks, and American Foreign Policy. And I don't know if this one is so much talks about foreign policy, but it's still my favorite, and that's Left and Right, The Prospects for Liberty. If people have never read those, that's my favorite Rothbard. I hope they'll read.
All right. And Rachel and others are suggesting The Brothers by Stephen Kinzer.
It's on the pod. I haven't read it.
Okay. All right. Anything we have to do to close out? Is Matt around, our producer?
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. Did anybody else have any questions? Anything you wanted to ask me? As long as we're staying over, I don't mind if anybody had anything to say. We didn't really... Here comes
it's too important. Okay.
Here we go.
Hi, I'm having some lag problems maybe, so I may freeze up here, but I do have questions over here in the questions tab. I have a ton of questions. I'm going to pare some of them down because there are a lot of repeats. Let's see. Marcella asks, are moderate Muslims condemning?
Yes. Well, okay, all Shia on earth absolutely hate their guts. And say 99.999% of Sunnis absolutely hate their guts. We're talking about, say, tops 30,000 guys, a militia of 30,000 guys out of a global population of 1.2 billion Muslims who live predominantly from Morocco to the Philippines. The biggest Muslim nation is in Indonesia. And there are more Muslims in India, or as many, somewhere right around as many in India as there are Arab Muslims in the Arabian Peninsula and Iraq and Mesopotamia and into Syria. So, yeah, there are a hell of a lot of Muslims that aren't even Arab at all, aren't even from that region at all. And I don't know exactly what is the percentage of Sunni Arabs who qualify as Wahhabist, or even, actually much worse, Salafists, who would actually tend to support something like ISIS. But it's an extremely small percentage of Muslims as a whole, and probably, I would bet, a very small percentage, even if you narrow it down to Sunni Arab Muslims who actually live in the region. And the specific question, wow. Yes, if you look, you will see absolute condemnations of them from scholars in Egypt, in Saudi Arabia, in Qatar, everywhere, because it's a very important doctrinal position whether this guy Baghdadi ought to declare himself the caliph or not. He's not just creating a state based on Sharia law. He is saying, I, Baghdadi, am the self-appointed leader of all Sunni Muslims, all Muslims in the world. And you can either bow down or get killed. And so they just don't agree with that. You find the religious leaders of the region are absolutely condemning this, and they ain't gotta be moderate, right? They could love Al-Qaeda, and they're condemning the Islamic State for even coming into existence as a theological thing,
Yeah, and that seems like something that we ought to be hearing on the news, but I've never heard.
They're not going to highlight that.
Any of that.
Yeah, you would have to look real carefully to find that kind of thing. But you know what? If you're really interested, there's a book called What Muslims Really Think that was put out in 2010 by the Gallup poll, and they did a real very, very in-depth study in every Muslim country other than maybe other than Iraq, because it was just so war torn and what have you at the time. But they went to virtually every Muslim country from Morocco to the Philippines, and they just interviewed everybody all the time. And the consensus virtually everywhere was that they love America, they love white people, they love Christians, they love Jews. They don't care. Just stop bombing them. It's simply, we hate your government, we hate your foreign policy. Stop supporting our dictators. Stop supporting jihadi revolutionaries when you're not supporting our dictators. And stop setting our cities on fire from the air, for crying out loud. And otherwise, keep sending us Hollywood movies. We love them. And keep selling us blue jeans. They really do love Americans and love America. They really do. The book is called What Muslims Really Think.
All right, our next question is from Antoinette Spacca. She asks, after all this, can America extract itself? Is there a way out?
Absolutely. Just come home. See? Look, wrong phone. Just come home. That's it. Just call it off. I'll tell this the very quickest way I can. This has been going on since Woodrow Wilson. A president gets us into a war. There are terrible consequences from the war. And then the next president says, oh my God, we've got to go and solve this problem from the last war. And then they go and solve that problem, and then they go solve another one and another one. So because of Wilson's intervention in World War I, not just because of World War I, but because of Wilson's intervention in World War I, it led to the rise of the Nazis in Germany and the communists in Russia, and the British and the French took over the entire Middle East, created Palestine, drew the Sykes-Picot line between Iraq and Syria that's being dissolved right now, etc., etc., etc. Increased the size of the British Empire 1 million square miles. So then America had to go help the British and the communists defeat the Nazis in World War II. But then that helped build up the communists so much because they conquered all of Eastern Europe, and they helped put Mao in charge in China. And so now we had to have a gigantic Cold War against them, including backing the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, including overthrowing the government of Iran, which just meant that, of course, once the people of Iran overthrew him back and put their own guy in power, that we had to support Saddam Hussein in order to contain the Iranian revolution. But then Saddam got too big for his britches, so we had to we had to bomb him and occupy Saudi Arabia, which just turned our Mujahideen friends against us, knocked our towers down. So then we go bomb, blockade, invade Iraq again. And then what happens after Iraq? The Mujahideen go home to Libya, where Obama takes their side against Gaddafi. The Mujahideen go home to Syria, where Obama takes their side against Gaddafi. So now Obama, same president, has to go clean up the mess from his last two wars that are now blowing back to this one. And so you see my point. There is no president who's a good enough president or a good enough leader of, military strategy and tactics or whatever to ever finally wrap this thing up. I left out how the Libya war spread west into Mali. In the Western Sahara Desert, they had a giant war, and spreading down into Nigeria even. At some point, you gotta just stop. You're not the one fixing it, America. You're not helping. They say, Colin Powell had the Pottery Barn rule that says if you break a pot at the Pottery Barn, you have to buy it. You own it now. And okay, well, that's first of all not actually a rule at the Pottery Barn. It's just something that Thomas Friedman made up. That's never been their policy. But secondly, if say another pottery shop that does have that policy, if the owner is telling you, get out, I'll clean it up, just go, you have an obligation to just go. Especially you continue breaking pots as you try to clean up the first one. Just get the hell out. And no, that doesn't mean that peace is going to break out over there, but it does mean that the distortions of relative power between the different factions that would be engendered by American intervention will not come into play. And instead you will have a solution that is much more likely to be a permanent solution, right? It's like we don't have a war over the line between Texas and Louisiana because we settled this in the past already, and it's not that big of a deal. The relative power between the two has already worked itself out. And that kind of thing is not going to is going to be much harder to take place while we're still over there stirring everything up with our unmatched military capability. I mean, there's just no question about how much raw power we can bring to bear, but all we can do is use that power for evil, basically, for setting up worse consequences. And I'm sorry that wasn't the short answer, but I tried.
Our next question comes from Jorge Medina. He asks if I can get the questions tab to comply with me. This really is some disgusting, depressing, bad shit. How do you deal with it emotionally?
I smoke a lot of weed.
Good answer.
Yeah. I mean, for me, I'm just pretty much an aggressive, horrible asshole in public. I mean, I get on Twitter and basically condemn everyone pretty much daily. You don't. I don't think you do deal with it. I mean, every former and current staffer has dealt with some kind of weird thing, and no, you don't. It's different than a normal job.
Yeah, it's frustrating. But at the same time, it's important work and it needs to be done. And, there are a lot of people who, I mean, really, look at the people who are actually suffering in this thing.
Yeah.
So I'm going to complain I got to sit in my comfortable chair and complain about their suffering. I can't quite bring myself to do it, It's a good position to be in, to try to do the right thing.
It's important. Scott always talks about calling the score right on the game. I mean, there may be limited things. I want to kind of refer to one of the questions in the chat room about what do we do personally. But it's something about having a clear conscience is that where you stood on the right side of things when it mattered. People always talk about the right side of history. This is the right side of the future. And it's a universal moral question. I mean, this isn't something debatable about. It doesn't have the same weight as, let's say, the Chicago school versus Austrian school. I mean, this is very different. We're talking about killing civilians. We're talking about killing people. This is mass murder every day that you're a part of. Sorry about all the wiggling. It's just hot. It's like 98 degrees here still. It's the worst. I mean, it's the worst thing that government does. How could you not say something? How can you not do it? I saw in the chat room someone says, "What do we do personally?" or where do we start? The thing is to stop thinking like libertarian activists and start thinking like normal people, and that means doing normal people things. You go and talk to your non-libertarian friends about the war, and you don't tell them about our secret agenda about vending machines with heroin for 7-year-olds, even though that is obviously part of our plan. They can find that out later. Right now, you talk about the simplest things. And you appeal to people at their level where they are. You figure out who you're talking to and try to answer concerns. If people are concerned about national security, you talk about blowback. You talk about having a lighter footprint. You talk about a more constitutional foreign policy. Now, is that something that comes normally to an anarchist? No. I'm not trying to sell people on anarchism. I'm trying to sell people into not killing others. So just stick with the limited, narrow agenda and talk to people in a civilized, rational manner about things they can understand and answer their concerns. And that includes things like, how do Muslims think, and maybe really and answer their questions seriously and don't dismiss them, because people hear propaganda day in and day out. Even though people talk about how little viewing there is of cable news network and how they're losing market share, the fact is a lot of people get their talking points directly from Fox News and its and its affiliate groups like Rush Limbaugh. That's where people are learning the slogans. So you have to come up with the answers and not think of it in such a way that we're selling the entire libertarian package. But mostly that you have to talk to people who aren't part of the libertarian world. And that means you go to religious groups, you go to wherever your cultural festivals are, you go to shopping malls, you go to the library, you go where people actually are and you talk to them about the things that matter and find what the common ground is first. Now, I hate to use that stupid cliche, everyone's libertarian about something. That's probably not true, but you should be able to find a connection to someone and then work from there, and that's how you do it. It's not the way we normally think about how we sell libertarianism to people, but it's too important. I mean, that's why you don't bring the whole package with you. They don't need to know about our particular strange theories on all sorts of things, from raw milk to our sexual habits. They don't care. People don't really want to know about that. They want to not be afraid of of, Muslims on flying carpets coming down and shooting them with magic Arab rays, which I think is what a lot of people think. I mean, they're that ignorant. I mean, they don't realize that it's not Mars in Afghanistan. There's people who live there. Anyway, I'm sorry. I'm ranting a little bit because I'm so pissed that I'm still doing this a decade and a half later.
No, you're on fire. Our next question is from Michael Esch. He asks, how do you tell a soldier that fought over there and watched their friends die that it was a waste of time?
You don't say it was a waste of time, but Scott, maybe you take this one.
Well, it all depends on the context. I mean, you shouldn't pick a fight just to pick a fight. If he wants to have a real discussion about it and he wants to really know, then, that wouldn't really be my point to argue. Or at least if that's the point you really want to make, then I would say, get your facts together and argue it well and explain that, listen, in effect, look back on it now. The purpose of that war was to give Baghdad to the Shia. Okay? So, are you happy that your buddy died in that? Was it worth it to die in that? And the truth is, the reason that soldiers fight is for their friends in their unit. They don't fight for democracy for Arabs or whatever. They fight for the guys in their unit because they don't want it to be their fault if somebody gets killed. And so that's it. And they're a band of brothers out there, and they fight for each other regardless of what country they're in, regardless of what the mission is, of what the mission specifically is. My job for Antiwar.com used to be answering the letters to the editor from back in the heyday of the Iraq War. And the soldiers would write in and say, you traitor, here we are in the middle of a war fighting for your freedom, and you stab us in the back and say these terrible things. And I would say, you're not fighting for freedom. You're fighting for the Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq, led by Abdul Aziz al-Hakim and his Badr Brigade faction that tortures people to death with power drills. And you're fighting to make them the dictatorship of Iraq and instill Islamic law and enslave their women and girls, unlike it ever was under Saddam, and torture and murder all the Sunnis and kick them out of Baghdad. And then they would respond to me, Jesus, I have no idea what you're talking about. I was going out on a mission, and we were going to find the bad guys and fight them in order so that there could be a democracy. Right? So in other words, they don't have any idea what they're talking about, what they're actually doing, who they're fighting for. And, I'm no genius. I was just, reading Bob Dreyfus. I just knew where to look for, who are the reporters and the analysts who understand this stuff in the brass tacks and the nuts and bolts and who's really who and what do they want. And so what would happen is they would sometimes just not answer back anymore. And other times they would say, well, thank you. I guess I did kind of learn something. And I guess, I don't know, should I learn about this Hakim guy or what, And so, I mean, and it depends. Again, if this soldier is a friend of yours or something, you might, you want to soften the blow a little bit. You might explain how it's supposed to work, in theory, is that America's a democracy run by adults who are capable of reason, and they wouldn't come to a consensus in their democratic system and through their democratic institutions that it was time to start a war unless they were sure. And they wouldn't be sure unless they were right. And so the men who sign up for the army ought to, again, this is the narrative that we're all raised on. The men in the army ought to be able to count on the rest of us who have made this decision well for them. Their job isn't deciding whether it's a good mission or not. I mean, obviously they're not supposed to commit war crimes, but their job is following the orders that presumably flow from a legitimate democratic process that assigned them the mission. And then so all those assumptions adding up to, so it's okay. It's the right thing. It's like that time that FDR sent the guys, dressed them up in green and sent them to go and fight the Nazis. It was the right thing. Meet the Wehrmacht on the field and blow their asses up. Nothing wrong with that. That's just what goes without saying. That's what people believe when they sign up. is that whatever the mission is, they wouldn't send me on it if it wasn't legit. And so that's where, certainly when you're talking with military people, you have a steeper hill to climb. If they went over there and did their part in something that it turns out later they have to decide maybe was the wrong thing. The flip side of that is I know a guy who was a veteran of the Iraq War who had terrible PTSD, wide awake nightmares all day long, the horrors that he lived through and saw. But it wasn't until he could finally admit to himself that it was all a lie, it wasn't worth it. He should have never kicked in those doors. He should have never done what he did to those people. That was when his PTSD finally broke, and he could come to terms with his moral injury, as they call it, forgive himself, and move forward. And now he's an anti-war activist. He does what he can to compensate and make up for what he did wrong by doing the right thing now. But this is what has helped him move forward with his life, is saying, you know what, George Bush lied to me, I bought it, and I gotta own that. It's my responsibility that I believed it, and I'm sorry, and so now what's next? And so, that's one angle on it. It's a sad story, but it's the way it is.
Our next question is from Lucy Steigerwald. Lucy asks,
Hi, Lucy.
The only thing more common than libertarians disappointing me on war is their disappointing me on Israel. What do you do when people dispute facts? It's a nice country, see? Secular.
That's a big pile of bullshit, actually.
What I do, my advice to her is basically the same rap that I gave about how, and this doesn't count for everyone, but I believe that the vast majority of Americans who are bad on Israel don't know anything about it. And that, I've just seen it with my own eyes. It's true for me, as well as it's been true for other people right in front of me before, where I say, go and just put it in Google Images and go look at a map for a moment, okay? Israel is not the tiny little helpless country that's besieged by enemies. The Palestinians are the tiny little helpless country that already they've been kicked off their land for not being Jewish in the first place. And now they're held in a giant concentration camp like Escape from New York, Prison by the Sea, where the Israelis massacre them for fun from time to time to punish them for, not just all going drowning themselves in the Mediterranean Sea, I guess. And so those are the facts. And according to the facts, unless you just outright are a fascist and you side with power and you side with the strong against the helpless and you side with violent force against law and property, then you got to change your position. That's it. You're either Palestinians are human beings and they have rights, or they're not. And if you line it up that way, then it's pretty easy to tell who's on whose side. And then once somebody explains, no, I'm a conservative and I don't think Arabs have rights, then you can say, okay, fine, but I'm done arguing with you because you're worthless. Next.
And to be a little, and by the way, people can read Lucy's fine work at Antiwar.com. She's one of our featured columnists, I believe, on Wednesday night. So, and you can read her great work on police state there too. Murray Rothbard was always good on the subject of Israel-Palestine long before anyone else cared about the topic. I hate saying things like that, but to say, he really was ahead of his time. And in terms of libertarians in Israel, there hasn't been basically a better writer on the subject probably recently than Sheldon Richman, and he's been absolutely courageous and straightforward in terms of explaining the history of the occupation, because it's not something that just happened yesterday. Gaza wasn't just something, a few rockets that happened a few weeks ago. This has been an ongoing problem, but it is the matter, of course, of why occupation is wrong. But it's colonialism, and it's really the last colonial project, right? We will finally be done with this kind of insane behavior. It's like it's from another century soon, I hope.
Yeah, I hope so. Someone asked me a good question about the 1967 war, and I said, geez, I don't know. Let me see. Oh, I know. 1967, Israel, Rothbard. And up came this excellent essay that's actually published at antiwar.com. Who was around in 1967 and good on everything? Rothbard. So, as luck would have it, there comes the best essay anyone ever wrote about the 1967 war, and it came out, 2 months later.
Yes. That particular part of the libertarian movement has always been really good on that subject. That's great. Thank you. Someone start putting some links up.
Yeah, great.
But it's just the issue
Should we
too.
let them
Of just
go before they...
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. I could keep going for days. I don't care. I'm on a roll rant listening to this.
I'm happy to stay too, but I don't want it to be so long that people don't want to...
absolutely.
What are some more questions? But I was just going to say, thinking like Lucy, it's the issue of empire. If libertarians went very, very, there was something that happened in the movement in 2001 where, and it's easy to blame it on the professional objectivists, but literally a lot of people fell for the propaganda and became, moral cowards. It takes gonads to be a libertarian, obviously in the face of the state, because we live in that state and it's empire at home. I guess the whole thing that I forgot to say was, we started, with Waco. And I was going to say to Scott earlier, it all comes back to Ferguson.
Right.
The war came home. It's here. And it is everything, the worst possible things, police brutality, the perpetual cycle of racism and classism, all the horrible things it's what this is all about. That's why we do this. That's why these issues are so important. So, I mean, to explain these things in the most civilized way possible to non-libertarians is probably the best thing we can do.
Right, yeah, absolutely. And by the way, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say real quick, that's part of what Osama bin Laden said back in the 1990s before the 9/11 attack, or maybe it was right after it when he was justifying it and explaining it, was he was trying to create in America what he called a choking life, meaning a domestic police state for the Americans. That part of our overreaction, it wouldn't just be bogging down our soldiers in the sands of the Middle East, but that our government would be under such political pressure to never allow an attack again that they would clamp down in a police state fashion on all of us so much that it would end up provoking resentment and provoking that reaction that we would finally end up, if bankruptcy doesn't get us first, we might finally end up saying to the government that, listen, if this police state is the price of this empire, then we just don't want it. And so that is another part of what he was trying to get us to do. Create a Department of Homeland Security, pass a Patriot Act, unleash the NSA, create a TSA, take off your shoes and stare at your socks and stay in line and don't say a peep. And they said that the motive was because how free we are is why they attacked us. But instead of saying, well, screw you guys, we're going to stay free anyway, they adopted the attitude, well, we're going to have to get rid of the freedom then. And then that way we can keep all our troops in Saudi Arabia, you see.
All right, well, that wraps it up for our questions for the evening. I'd like to tell people what's going on this week here at Liberty Me EU. Tomorrow night we actually have Sheldon Richman. The Future of Freedom Foundation is moving.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but Joe said he had a question.
Joe actually had a statement in the questions tab. He said it's ironic how much the Jews ended up following in the Nazis' footsteps.
You mean Israelis?
That's a bit overstated.
Yeah.
I could see why you
I think... I think it's very important when we're having these conversations to avoid saying things like that, even if we do say, the Israelis followed in the Nazis' footsteps. Well, that's a little bit hyperbolic, maybe, but even just if we can make the case against what the Israeli state is doing without comparing it to the Nazis and getting all distracted by that, I think we have...
On the other hand, it's a fair comparison, the way that the people in the Gaza Strip live to the way the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto lived. I mean, the reason, the whole thing about whatever's law where you're not ever allowed to bring up Hitler, I think is, goes too far. I mean, it's actually a perfectly apt, and Godwin's law, thank you, Lucy. It's a perfectly apt analogy to compare the Gazans to the Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto. Now, maybe that doesn't exactly make the Israelis on the outside the same as the Gestapo, but tell that to some lady who just buried her entire family a few weeks ago because the Israelis felt like slaughtering them in the most uneven fight probably since World War II and Nazi war against civilians. So it's pretty damn bad over there, and yes, you're absolutely right. Everyone must always differentiate between members of a religious or an ethnic identity versus the politicians who rule any particular state. But I think it is absolutely fair to compare the victims of Israel to the victims of the Nazis, at least.
Yeah. Tomorrow, we're actually going to have Sheldon Richman, who you mentioned just a few moments ago. He's going to be giving a talk on the 100th anniversary of the great state crime, World War I, and he'll be discussing that tomorrow evening. The Future of Freedom Foundation is going to be doing a monthly webinar here at Liberty Me U. And that starts tomorrow. On Wednesday night, Cal Molinay is going to be starting his monthly show, which is going to be called Fight the Matrix. He's going to talk about anarchy and how we can get there, how you can answer questions about anarchy, or how you can ask your own questions to him about it as well. And Thursday, we actually have two classes at 2:30 p.m. Eastern. Jeffrey Tucker will start his 9-session course on the life and times of Ludwig von Mises and his work, and that's going to be excellent. And then at 8 p.m. Eastern, Roderick Long is going to give a talk on virtue ethics and libertarianism. So we're going to have a great week here at Liberty Me U. Hope to see you all back here. Thanks so much, Angela and Scott. This has been amazing and informative, and we hope to have you back. Thanks so much. Y'all take care.
So
good night.
And thanks to all you guys for listening and watching. Appreciate it.
Yeah, we really appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Full circle with all the horrible things that one could have assumed that would happen if we continued with an empire at home, empire everywhere, because we're under it. When we met because of Waco, and Waco was what changed me from. I mean, I was always a standard issue libertarian, but my objective as dominant Jane was really heavy. I mean, I was that objective as jerk that no one, people would run from. Waco definitely tempered that instincts in me, but Waco is what made me see some things differently too about the Rothbardian centrality of the war issue, and that's kind of, and then by 9/11, I think both of us kind of ruined perfectly normal lives by going in this direction, and that's kind of why it's like a sad, weird thing. 15 years later, we're still sitting here. But I kind of wanted you to go a little bit into the history of different phases of Iraq, so we can understand why we're still here and why it's absolutely the worst this time.
Well, I don't know, Angela. Honestly, like I'm stuck like this anyway. If it was nothing else, I would just hate cops and be a libertarian radio show host about cops or something, probably. But really, definitely the reason that I'm stuck like this permanently with no hope is because of 11, 12 years ago, and not just September 11th, but just how obvious it was, the way that they announced, we're going to lie to you right to your face for the next year and a half, and then we're going to start a war against Iraq. It was just unbelievable. I mean, maybe some of the people watching tonight were too young to remember kind of the way that happened, but they really were, for people paying close attention, it was obvious in the fall of 2001 that they're going to Iraq. So then, the invasion didn't happen until 2003, March 2003. So it was a year and a half of the slowest motion train wreck in the entire world. And, you could have been anybody, as long as you didn't have a reason to want to buy into it and believe in it, then it was obviously the world's worst hoax. And it was obviously going to be an absolute disaster. And, So
radio station, Free Radio Austin, in 1998.
Right. Yeah, the very end of 1998.
And what were the early
themes? It ain't
themes?
so. Well, I mean, honestly, I was more kind of a New World Order conspiracy kook back then, like a one world government guy. Even though I wasn't a John Birch Society conservative, I was always a libertarian. But I did buy the whole grand design toward building the United Nations into a world federal government kind of thing. And then I should have learned that was wrong by the time of the Kosovo War in '99. But I didn't really finally shake all that stuff till about the time of the Iraq War. But anyway, I was a connoisseur of the very best of left and right conspiracy stuff, and I still to this day. But back then, I was highly motivated and energized by the Waco massacre and the cover-up of the Oklahoma City bombing, and I learned very early on, because of my kind of conspiracy readings and stuff, about the connection between central banking and war. And even though I guess I probably was pretty default anti-war anyway, when I learned all this kind of criticism of it from more of kind of a John Birch right-wing point of view, a very anti-war point of view, not because they're kind of hippies and saying give peace a chance, but just because they're saying this is what's destroying America on the inside, is waging all this war without. And so whether they're really, working on building a world government or not is beside the point when you get to the question of militarism abroad and then coming back home again, as obviously we're suffering now. So that's kind of been my thing. My first show on Free Radio Austin was all about Waco and the realignment, how the best of the left and the right can realign with the libertarians for peace and the Bill of Rights and save all the stupid culture war stuff and fighting about gay marriage and abortions and whatever other stuff people want to fight about until after. Some of that's worked out. Other stuff now.
Well, I wanted you to do that as an introduction because Waco is kind of a central symbol to kind of why we're still here tonight and why I think we've sort of come for.
But I thought that was the whole thing. And they didn't outright say, well, Dick Cheney did, and the neocons on the lower level did. But Bush and Rice and the very highest level people, other than the vice president, didn't really say Saddam did it. But they were happy to let your mom believe that kind of a thing. They were happy to let that be the impression and warn that, he's going to give his chemical weapons to these guys to do on us next time. And so we got to go ahead and stop them now. And that was the biggest misconception. And people just filled in the blank themselves because they just couldn't imagine if they were the president that they would exploit 9/11, the worst thing in the whole world. They're going to exploit it like they might as well have done it themselves, the bastards, in order to launch an extra war against an extra country and threaten 60 more. Like, people just couldn't get their head around that. They couldn't believe that America is run by evil men. Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what they'll do. It's the worst. And so, yeah, that was the worst of it. And then look what they did. They created such a mess that where there literally was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq before 9/11, before the invasion in 2003. There's now 30,000 of them, and they have their own country now.
Well, let's to give it some context, and I know because I'm judging from the chat room, there's many young people in the room, which is great because there was a time not very long ago where some of us thought, wow, we're the last generation that it dies with us. And that was 2006. A lot of us were thinking that. So this is a miracle that young people are listening. But to give context to the events of 9/11, just short and sweet, what happened at 9/11 and why, and we're talk about the why and sort of the larger context of terrorism.
Well, the best thing to do, and we're trying to keep this a little bit light, right? So here's what you do if you want a good laugh, chat room. Go and find the interview of Bin Laden's son from Rolling Stone magazine from 2010. And he tells the reporter from Rolling Stone all about how in the summer before the 9/11 attack, right before
Nope.
All right, thanks everyone for coming tonight. Welcome to Liberty Me You. We're here tonight with Angela Keaton and Scott Horton. Angela is the director of operations at Antiwar.com, and Scott Horton is former host of Antiwar.com Radio and now host of the syndicated talk show, The Scott Horton Show. And tonight they're going to discuss why war is some bad shit. As Angela said earlier, it may be a little depressing. I can't advise the usual drinking games in good conscience unless you really know how you're going to handle it. So be careful out there. It's dangerous. Don't want to have any casualties. So without further ado, I'll give you Angela Keaton and Scott Horton.
Or do you have audio yet? Okay, I guess we do. All right.
Yeah, I'm fine.
Okay, terrific. All right, my name is Angela. I've worked at Antiwar.com now since 2008 and became involved with the organization in 2006 thanks to this man who's on the other screen here, Scott Horton. Scott, quick introduction because I want to jump right in with asking you some questions.
Oh, me, I'm just a radio show host from Austin, and I host Antiwar Radio on KPFK in LA and the Scott Horton Show for the Liberty Radio Network.
All right. All right, Scott, I think we're going to start at the beginning.
Really, I guess I could say I pretty much am the editor of Antiwar.com, even though I got laid off 2 years ago. I do all the work, so I think that counts. So.
Yeah, basically, yes. Well, the thing is, though, tonight, we were talking about this earlier, that, you and I were going to have this conversation tonight, and it's weird because 15 years ago, did you think that you and I would still be doing what we're doing, or there'd be a need for us to do what we're doing? And I kind of wanted to go back to the beginning, and actually, you kind of surprised me with a year earlier. You started at the now infamous Piper.
Yeah, I mean, that was what really solidified, my turn toward, like, this is what I absolutely have to do. Somebody's got to do it. Somebody has to contradict these people. And I guess I'm pretty good at it, so I try to, for what good it does, I don't know. But, yeah, I mean, the level of dishonesty, and it's remained, but the level of dishonesty in 2002 and 3, some serious, all-time world historical levels of lies. It's just absolutely beyond the pale,
Well, what were some of the popular misconceptions about what people thought the war was about going back now 12 years? What did the average person think? Because this is kind of key to how they were able to do this.
Well, I think what the average person thought was that Saddam did it. And, I've talked about this on my radio show a million times because it's just the perfect example. I was a cab driver at the time, and I had a guy in my cab who was a real estate developer and was a millionaire and was like, the Mr. Big Shot at the country club and all this stuff. He was a really smart guy. I mean, he knew a lot of stuff about a lot of stuff, not just real estate or something. He was a very worldly type of a dude, millions of dollars and a high education. And I got in the world's worst argument with him. But it was an honest argument. You know what I mean? It wasn't like too mad. And what he just could not get over was, well, if Saddam didn't do 9/11, then why are we attacking him? And I think that really sums up basically the misconception of the American people about the whole thing was, well, come on. I mean, we wouldn't be attacking a country that didn't have anything to do with it. So this country must have something to do with it. And it was really a year and a half, 2 years into the war when Bush finally cornered in a press conference. Someone said, yeah, but what did Iraq have to do with that? And he said, with what? And they said 9/11. And he said, nothing. And there were people across America, by 100 million people, were just dropped their glass and spit milk out their nose and couldn't believe what they just heard. What did he just say? Nothing to do with it.